My sister gave birth, but when my husband held the baby, he said call the police, and then we found. It was already dark by the time I stepped out of Boston City General, the kind of December cold that seeps into your bones hitting me full in the face. I pulled my coat tighter and walked faster toward the parking garage, my feet aching from a 14-hour shift in the ER. 10 years as a nurse, and somehow the ache never gets familiar, but the satisfaction does. That night, two of my patients were discharged, both of them smiling. It's those little wins that keep you going when your scrubs still smell faintly of antiseptic and cafeteria coffee. As I drove home, I thought about Sophie. My younger sister was 8 months pregnant, and we were heading to her place after dinner. She had called me the night before just to tell me she thought the baby had hiccups, laughing about it like it was the funniest thing in the world. I smiled remembering it, and then my stomach rumbled as I turned onto our street. My husband Jonas always cooked when I had long shifts. He said it helped him decompress from court. The lights were already on when I stepped inside. The smell of roasted garlic and something savory floated out from the kitchen, and before I could say anything, Jonas appeared with a wooden spoon in one hand and an apron still tied awkwardly around his waist. "Welcome home, warrior," he said, grinning as he pulled me into a hug. I leaned against him for a moment, letting his warmth and the quiet hum of the house ease the hospital noise still buzzing in my head. Jonas had a voice that always sounded calm, even when he was in the middle of some brutal custody case or fielding angry calls from clients at midnight. He worked in family law, divorces, parental rights, property disputes, the kind of legal work that dragged the worst out of people. And yet, somehow, he still had this way of protecting a small, peaceful space for us both. "How's Sophie doing today?" I asked while kicking off my shoes. "She texted this afternoon," he said, turning back to stir the pot. "She's been sorting baby clothes and eating frozen grapes. Apparently, that's her new craving. She told me she was deciding between Liam and Noah for a boy. Did she tell you that?" "She did," Jonas said. "And Emery, if it's a girl." I told her they all sound like names of very polite children. I laughed and grabbed 2 plates from the cupboard. The simplicity of that evening made me feel lucky in a way I didn't often admit out loud. We ate quickly, and by 8, we were in the car, headed towards Sophie's apartment just off Boylston. The air outside was sharp, and frost had already crept up the edges of the windshield. I rubbed my hands together, thinking again about Sophie, how she used to crawl into my bed when she had nightmares, even as a teenager. After Mom died, we leaned on each other like 2 kids in a storm. When Sophie met Nate 2 years ago, I saw a new kind of light come into her. He was quiet, but thoughtful. He worked in commercial construction, managing large-scale projects that had him bouncing between cities. He was the kind of man who sent Sophie texts at lunch just to check if she was eating. He called me sis from the start, and it felt natural. That's what made everything that happened later so impossible to believe. Their wedding had been small, but full of warmth. I remember crying when Sophie walked down the aisle in that simple cream dress. Jonas held my hand the entire ceremony, squeezing it each time I sniffled. I never questioned Nate's love for her. He doted on Sophie like he'd spent his whole life waiting just to meet her. When she told us she was pregnant, Nate almost lifted her off the ground in excitement. He talked endlessly about building the perfect nursery, comparing crib brands, and discussing wall decals as if preparing a presentation. He joked that he'd become a dad bot, programmed to install baby monitors and fold tiny onesies. Even when he was working weekends, he always made time to attend her appointments. Sophie said he talked to the baby every night, whispering through her belly as if the baby could already understand the sound of love. As we drove through the half-lit streets, Jonas glanced at me and said, "You know, I've never seen Nate look as happy as he did at that last sonogram. When they showed the baby's face on screen, he looked like he wanted to jump through the monitor and hold it." "He's going to be a great dad," I replied without hesitation. "They both are. They're ready." We parked and walked up to their building, the sound of our boots crunching over the salted sidewalk. Nate opened the door before we could knock. He looked exhausted, but his smile was genuine. "Hey, come in. Sophie's been waiting all day," he said, giving me a quick hug. Inside, the apartment was warm and softly lit. Sophie was curled up on the couch, a blanket over her lap and both hands cradling her belly. Her face glowed with that strange, gentle light some women get near the end of pregnancy. She looked at me and beamed. "You're here. Don't even try getting up," I said, hurrying over and sitting beside her. "You stay right there. How's the little one?" "Active," she grinned. "He or she is doing somersaults. Nate says they're training for the Olympics." I glanced at Jonas. He was already helping Nate carry snacks into the living room. There was something so normal about that night, so wonderfully mundane. We drank tea, laughed about baby names, and made gentle jokes about future diaper explosions. It felt like the kind of evening you'd want to wrap in a memory and store someplace safe, just in case the world turned stormy later. And it did. But back then, I had no idea we were only 1 month away from the night everything changed. The day Sophie went into labor, Boston was under a thick gray sky, the kind that makes you want to stay in bed and forget the world for a while. But that morning, my phone rang just after 5 a.m., and I sat straight up before it even buzzed a second time. Sophie's voice was shaky but excited. She said the contractions had started and that Nate was already loading the car. I told her we'd be at the hospital as soon as we could, grabbed my coat, and called Jonas while pulling my hair into a messy bun. We met them at Boston Medical Center just as Nate was helping her into the wheelchair. Her face was flushed with pain, but she still managed to smile when she saw us. "It's happening," she whispered through clenched teeth, gripping Nate's hand so tightly that his knuckles were white. The hours crawled. Jonas and I waited outside the delivery room, sipping terrible vending machine coffee and making small talk with nurses I'd worked alongside on night shifts. Every so often, I'd pace the hallway, then check my phone, then pace again. Jonas tried reading from a legal brief he'd brought, but I could see his eyes weren't moving across the page. Around 3 in the afternoon, we heard it, the unmistakable cry of a newborn echoing down the corridor. Nate came out moments later, his face red with tears, beaming in a way I had never seen before. "He's here," he said. "Liam's here. 8 pounds even. He's perfect." I rushed to hug him, and Jonas followed close behind. For a moment, all the exhaustion disappeared. All that remained was this overwhelming sense that life had shifted in the best possible way. Nate led us into the room after Sophie had been cleaned up. She looked exhausted, but when she saw us, her face lit up again. She held Liam in her arms like he was spun from light and cotton and something even more delicate. I stood by her side, brushing her hair back gently, and whispered, "You did it. He's beautiful." Sophie laughed softly and said, "I can't believe he's real." When she passed the baby to me, I cradled him carefully, my years in the ER making it second nature. But this wasn't just another newborn. This was Liam. This was the child I had sung to through her belly and dreamed about helping raise. His tiny fingers curled instinctively around mine, and I remember whispering, "You've already stolen so many hearts, little one." Then I handed him to Jonas. He took Liam like he was handling glass, unsure but reverent. He stared at the baby's face longer than I expected, his brows slightly drawn together. When I asked if he was okay, he just nodded, slowly, and whispered something I didn't quite catch. Later that evening, after we had returned home, Jonas grew quiet. We sat on the couch with our tea, but his usual warmth had cooled into something else. Calm on the outside, distracted on the inside. I finally asked him what was on his mind, thinking maybe it was work again. He didn't answer right away. Then he looked at me and said, very softly, "Elena, does Nate have any scars?" I blinked. "Scars?" He nodded. "Like a long one. Faint, but noticeable. On his left wrist." I thought about it. "I think so. I saw it once when he was wearing a short-sleeved shirt." "What?" Jonas looked down into his mug like the tea might answer for him. Then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. "There's a man I met during a bigamy case a few years ago. His name was Evan. Same height, same build. He also worked in construction. Said he traveled a lot between projects. Had that exact scar. And the same eye shape as Liam." At first, I actually laughed, thinking he was joking. But when I saw his face, calm, but pale, I stopped. I asked, "Are you serious? You think Nate is this Evan?" Jonas didn't answer directly. "It's probably nothing," he said. "Coincidences happen. I've just never forgotten that case. 3 wives in 3 states. He told each one he was single. Used fake names. Fake ID. He was good. Too good. I told him he was overthinking it. That exhaustion and emotion were blurring things. But even as I said the words, doubt started creeping in. Jonas didn't forget faces. It was something I'd seen in court when he'd recall a defendant's facial twitch or a subtle lie caught in a sigh. If something about Liam had triggered that memory in him, it wasn't for nothing. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I focused on helping Sophie adjust. I visited the hospital, brought her homemade soup, held Liam while she showered. Nate was always there, attentive and sweet, taking pictures, changing diapers, filling in paperwork. There was nothing unusual, nothing to suggest anything was off. And yet, every time Jonas looked at Liam, I saw something behind his eyes that didn't quite settle. Then, on the third night after the birth, I found Jonas in his home office, going through old files. Legal folders were spread out like pieces of a broken puzzle. I watched him trace his finger over a mugshot clipped to a report. The man looked a little younger, his hair styled differently, but even I had to admit, the resemblance was real. "That's Evan," Jonas said quietly. "Convicted 3 years ago. Released last year on probation. Last known alias, Mark. But I never saw any records of where he went afterward. Just vanished." Still, I resisted. "Jonas, come on. Nate's been with Sophie for 2 years. They had a wedding. We met his family." Jonas shook his head. "Bigamists lie. That's what they do. They build illusions. They hire actors, rent friends. Evan had the money and the smarts. He covered his tracks with terrifying precision. And that scar? That exact one. It was from an accident he described during testimony. Cut by rebar on a Chicago site. I felt a pit open in my stomach. My instinct screamed to deny it. But I also knew Jonas wouldn't throw around a suspicion like this unless he was sure. I sat down, covered my face with my hands, and whispered, "If it's true, what happens to Sophie?" Jonas's silence was answer enough. We knew we couldn't confront Nate. Not yet. Not without proof. Jonas contacted a detective he'd worked with, off the record, and asked for a quiet investigation. Meanwhile, I pretended everything was normal. I brought Sophie tea. I held Liam. I smiled at Nate when he offered me photos or asked about sleep patterns. Inside, though, I was unraveling. A week later, Jonas received a call confirming our worst fear. There was no record of a legal birth certificate for Nate under that name. But fingerprints from court documents matched the prints Jonas had on file from the Evan case. Nate, the man who had married my sister, wasn't Nate at all. He was Evan Ryland, convicted bigamist, now living under yet another name. And he was holding my nephew in his arms like he deserved to be part of this family. There's a kind of heaviness that settles into your chest when the truth becomes too sharp to ignore. It doesn't arrive all at once, but in slow, jagged pieces that bury themselves deeper the longer you try to pretend they aren't real. After Jonas received that call confirming Nate's fingerprints matched those from the Evan Ryland case, we just sat in silence. There weren't any words that could make it easier. Not for me, and certainly not for Jonas, who now carried the weight of knowing something that could destroy my sister's life. We didn't sleep that night. Jonas kept reading through old case notes, flipping between legal briefs and scanned documents that had now become more than evidence. They were the fragments of a man who had lied his way into our family. I paced between the bedroom and the hallway, trying not to scream, trying not to cry. Each time I imagined Sophie's face when we'd have to tell her, my chest got tighter. The next morning, Jonas contacted the same detective who had helped verify the fingerprints and asked him to initiate a formal investigation. We needed to be careful, he said. Evan, no, Nate, was dangerous in a way that didn't leave bruises but left entire lives in ruins. And if he caught even the smallest hint that someone had uncovered him again, he might disappear before we had the chance to stop him. That was the pattern with men like this. They never stayed still once exposed. I remember walking into Sophie's apartment that afternoon, trying to act normal while every part of me screamed that I shouldn't be there. Nate greeted me at the door, his arms full of folded baby blankets, his voice calm, his eyes steady. Nothing in his manner gave away the truth that now boiled just beneath the surface. Sophie was in the bedroom, asleep with Liam on her chest. I stood there for a moment, watching them breathe and sink, and I couldn't help but wonder if Liam already sensed something his mother didn't. I hated myself for thinking that, but I couldn't stop it. I turned away before the guilt swallowed me whole. Back at home that night, Jonas laid out the plan with careful precision. The detectives would question Nate quietly, politely, under the guise of an identity verification related to his work history. No handcuffs. No dramatic arrests in front of Sophie or the baby. Just a soft knock and a few simple questions designed to unmask the man behind the name. I asked Jonas if he would be the one to tell Sophie afterward, and he said no, that it should come from me. I didn't argue. I knew it had to be me. I was her sister. I was the one she called after every prenatal visit. The one she cried to when she had her first panic attack at 6 months. I had helped her breathe through contractions. I had held Liam while she slept, but knowing it had to be me didn't make it any easier. 2 days later, the detectives came to the hospital. Nate had brought Sophie and Liam in for a follow-up checkup, and Jonas coordinated with the staff ahead of time to avoid causing a scene. We waited in the hallway, just outside the pediatric unit, while two plainclothes officers approached Nate in the waiting room. I stood beside Jonas, heart pounding in my ears, wondering if everything would unravel right there in front of my sister. At first, Nate didn't seem fazed. One of the detectives asked to see his ID, casually mentioning a discrepancy in a background check related to his construction license. Nate laughed it off, said he'd always had issues with outdated paperwork. Then one of the officers pulled out a photo, an old mugshot of Evan Ryland, taken 3 years ago. The second the image touched Nate's hands, his smile faltered. He looked at the picture for barely 3 seconds before standing up too quickly. "I have to call my supervisor," he said, his voice louder than necessary. "I need to step outside for just a minute." But the officers didn't move. One of them gently placed a hand on his shoulder, not forcefully, but firmly enough to stop him. "That won't be necessary," the detective said calmly. "We'd like you to stay here and answer a few more questions." That was when I saw it, something I can't explain. Not fear, not guilt, something else. Something that looked like acceptance, as if he had always known this moment would eventually find him. He didn't argue, didn't resist. He just sat back down, let out a long breath, and stared at the photo like it held his whole life inside it. Meanwhile, Sophie had just come out of the pediatric wing with Liam in her arms. She looked confused at the sight of the officers but didn't yet understand what was happening. I stepped in before she could reach Nate and gently took Liam from her arms. I smiled, but I knew it didn't reach my eyes. "Something's going on with Nate's paperwork," I said softly. "Just routine. Let's go wait in another room, okay?" She hesitated. Her eyes darted to the waiting area, where Nate sat surrounded by two strangers who weren't strangers at all. "What do you mean routine? Why are there police?" Her voice was already beginning to tremble. Jonas stepped in and said the words that would unravel everything. "Sophie, I'm sorry, but that man isn't who he says he is. His real name is Evan Ryland. He's married to at least 2 other women." I'll never forget the look on her face in that moment. It wasn't just shock. It was like her entire reality cracked in half, and she was falling through the middle with no ground to land on. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood still, frozen, holding the pieces of a life that had been built on nothing but lies. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "That's not true. He's my husband. We got married. He was there when Liam was born. This isn't happening." But it was. Nate, Evan, was taken into custody quietly, without a struggle. He didn't say much, not even when Sophie begged him to explain. He just looked at her and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't want it to end like this." And then he was gone. Just like that, Sophie was a mother, a widow, and a victim of fraud all in one afternoon. She collapsed onto a bench just outside the pediatric unit, her hands trembling in her lap, her voice cracked open and empty. I held Liam close to my chest and sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. No words would make any sense now. Nothing could explain why the man who had kissed her forehead after birth, who had whispered lullabies to Liam, was the same man who had lied to at least 3 families before hers. But I knew one thing. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't let her face it alone. Grief doesn't move in straight lines. It loops, doubles back, stabs you when you least expect it, and then, just when you think it's over, it whispers something new to mourn. After Evan, because I could no longer think of him as Nate, was taken into custody, Sophie spent the first 3 days in silence. She stayed in our guest room, barely speaking, barely eating, holding Liam close as if he were the last solid thing left in her life. I remember walking past her door late at night and hearing her whispering to him, over and over, not full sentences, just broken phrases. "It's not your fault. You're still mine. We're okay. We're okay." I wanted to go in, to sit beside her, and tell her the worst was over, but I couldn't lie. It wasn't over. Not yet. Jonas spent that week on calls with the detectives, sorting through court records and filing emergency petitions. Because the marriage had been legally invalid from the start, Sophie was listed as an unwed mother. Liam had no legal father. Every document she had filled out, hospital forms, birth certificates, even her tax filings, had to be redone. I watched as Jonas explained the legal implications, line by line, as gently as he could, but with each new detail, Sophie looked a little more hollow. The worst part, though, wasn't legal. It was emotional. She kept asking questions that no one could really answer. Did he ever really love me? Was any of it real? How do I tell Liam the truth someday? I didn't have answers. I just sat beside her, held her hand, and let her cry into my shoulder while Liam slept between us in his bassinet. It was Jonas who reminded us both, gently but firmly, that Liam needed stability. That while we couldn't control what had happened, we could control what came next. We met with a trauma counselor. We talked through ways to rebuild legal identity, to secure full custody, and to protect Liam's future from the wreckage left behind. Jonas handled most of it. He was relentless, calm, and precise. He helped Sophie claim restitution through the court, argued for emotional damages, and ensured that Evan, already facing charges for bigamy, fraud, and document falsification, would be held responsible for what he had done to her and so many others. Sophie began to come back to life slowly, not in big bursts, but in the quiet choices. She started helping me cook again, even if it was just chopping carrots in silence. She began folding Liam's clothes with a kind of sacred care, smoothing each tiny onesie with both hands, like she was pressing love into the fabric. She started sleeping more than a few hours a night. These were small victories, but they mattered. 6 weeks after Evan's arrest, Sophie asked if she could move back into her own apartment. Jonas and I hesitated. We were worried it was too soon, but she insisted. I need to take my life back, she said. Not the one I thought I had. The real one. The one I build from here. We helped her pack the boxes. Most of what had belonged to Nate, or Evan, was already gone, either confiscated by police or burned in Sophie's quiet fury in our backyard fire pit. I stood beside her that night as she watched the last remnants of their wedding photos curl into ash, and for the first time since everything fell apart, she let herself sob without holding back. Sophie found a new apartment in the South End, a small third-floor walk-up with wide windows and an old brick fireplace. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Liam's crib fit in the corner of her bedroom, and she hung soft, star-shaped lights above it. She painted one wall a pale blue and put up a framed photo of the two of them, just mother and son, no lies in between. Eventually, she went back to work. Her old salon had filled her position, but a friend helped her find a new spot in a smaller place not far from her apartment. Her new boss knew what had happened and agreed to flexible hours. That meant everything. It gave her a reason to get up in the morning, to feel something besides regret. Jonas and I set up a weekly rotation so that Liam always had someone watching him. I'd cover mornings when Sophie opened the shop, and Jonas would take afternoons if I had shifts at the hospital. At night, we'd meet at her place for dinner or walk Liam around the block in his stroller until he fell asleep. We stopped talking about Evan, not because we forgot, but because we had already given that name too much space in our lives. Liam was growing fast, gurgling, gripping fingers, recognizing faces. And every time he smiled at Sophie, you could see something stitch itself back together inside her. One night, a few months after the arrest, we were sitting in her living room watching Liam kick his feet on a blanket. He was making tiny squealing sounds, testing out his voice, and Sophie laughed, really laughed, for the first time since the hospital. She looked at me and said, "You know, I used to think love came from the person who promised you everything. But maybe it comes from the people who stay when everything breaks." I didn't say anything. I just reached over and took her hand, and she squeezed it like she understood that I didn't need to answer. Jonas, who had been unusually quiet that evening, finally spoke up. "Sophie," he said gently, "I've started working with a few advocacy groups, people who help victims of marriage fraud. I think your story could help others if you're ever ready to share it." She didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. "Maybe not yet, but one day. If it helps someone walk away before it's too late, then yeah, I want something good to come out of this." That night, I watched Liam fall asleep in her arms, his face soft and peaceful, his tiny chest rising and falling against hers. Sophie rocked him slowly, humming under her breath, and I realized something that stuck with me long after I left. Even when everything else is ripped away, love finds its way back. And sometimes, what rises from the ashes is stronger than what came before. By the time autumn returned to Boston, the city was painted in shades of gold and rust. Trees along Commonwealth Avenue dropped leaves like memories, scattering the sidewalks in brittle color. Liam had just turned 1, and we threw him a small birthday party in Sophie's apartment. There were cupcakes, mismatched balloons, and a paper crown that he kept trying to chew. He took his first 3 steps in the middle of that living room, wobbling toward Jonas's open arms, while Sophie burst into happy tears. For the first time in a long time, there was nothing bittersweet about her smile. That year had changed us. All three of us. Sophie had become stronger, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Jonas was more patient than I'd ever seen him, choosing quiet over lectures, support over strategy. And me, I had learned to let go of the idea that you could protect people from everything. Sometimes, all you could do was stand next to them while the storm passed. Evan had been sentenced to 3 years for bigamy, fraud, and document forgery. There were still other civil cases pending, but his freedom was gone. He didn't try to contact Sophie again, not once, not even to see Liam. Part of me was relieved. The other part stayed on edge, never trusting that silence meant safety. 1 week after Liam's birthday, a package arrived. It was hand-delivered, no return address, and wrapped in thick brown paper with Sophie's name printed neatly on the front. She found it on her doorstep after work and brought it inside, assuming it was a late gift from one of the salon girls. She waited until Liam was napping to open it. I was in the kitchen, warming a bottle when I heard her voice from the living room. Not a scream, just a soft, stunned whisper. "Elena, come here." I walked in and saw her staring down at the contents of the box. Inside was a sealed envelope, a folded legal document, and 2 photographs. The first was of Evan, older, more tired, wearing an orange prison uniform. He was seated on a concrete bench beside a boy around 6 years old. The boy's eyes were sharp, dark, unmistakable. He looked like Liam would in 5 years. Too similar to ignore. The second photograph showed that same boy holding a small sign with his name, Caleb Ryland. Sophie's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. It contained a birth certificate. Mother's name redacted. Father, Evan Ryland. The child was born in Chicago, a year before Evan met Sophie. On the back of the photo was a single handwritten line. Liam deserves to know he has a brother. I'm sorry for everything. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Sophie just sat there, holding the letter in one hand and the photo in the other, her mouth slightly open like she was still trying to understand what the truth felt like. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were glassy, but she didn't cry. He had another child. A whole other child. And he never said a word. I nodded slowly, my voice barely audible. He was never going to. Sophie placed the photo of Caleb beside Liam's on the coffee table. They looked like puzzle pieces from the same set. She leaned back, covering her face with both hands, breathing slowly, deeply, like she was trying not to drown in this new wave. "Do I tell Liam?" she asked, voice hoarse. "When he's older, do I tell him he has a brother?" I didn't have an answer. All I could say was, not today, but maybe someday, yes. That night, after we put Liam to sleep, we sat with mugs of lukewarm tea and stared at the photo again. Jonas came by after work and we showed him everything. He read the letter twice, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. Then he said something I didn't expect. "We can find Caleb. We don't need to involve Evan. We just need to know where he is, who he's with, whether he's safe." It wasn't about responsibility or justice anymore. It was about connection. If there was a child out there who shared Liam's blood, someone just as tangled in Evan's web of lies, then maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to do something right for both of them. Sophie didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just placed Caleb's photo gently into the drawer beside the couch and said, "I need time." Weeks passed. Sophie returned to work. Liam started daycare twice a week, and life began humming again with a fragile kind of rhythm. But I noticed she looked at the photo some nights when she thought no one was watching. Her fingers would trace the edge, not with anger, not even with sadness, just quiet wonder. Wonder about a little boy in Chicago who had no idea he had a brother named Liam sleeping soundly 2 states away. One Saturday morning in early November, as we walked Liam through the public garden in his stroller, Sophie suddenly turned to me and said, "If I don't try to find Caleb, I think I'll regret it for the rest of my life." We didn't need much. Jonas pulled a few strings, found the mother's name through court documents, and tracked down a safe mailing address. No sudden visits. No lawyers. Just a letter, honest, gentle, written by Sophie's hand. She wrote about Liam, about herself, about what she didn't know and what she hoped could someday be possible. She didn't ask for anything, just offered an open door. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived. This time, it had a return address. Inside was a single photo of Caleb smiling at a playground, a note written in clear, careful handwriting. "He's healthy. He's happy. And when he's old enough, I'll tell him about his brother." Sophie stared at the photo for a long time before quietly placing it next to Liam's on the shelf above the fireplace. Then she turned to me and smiled, not the smile of someone who had won, but of someone who had finally made peace with everything they had lost. I don't know what the future looks like, she said, but I know we'll face it with our eyes open. And that, after everything, felt like enough.